Fire Nexus is a deck that I didn't give much credit to, especially in the first two sets and including in Daybreak, as Fire felt like it was lacking some cohesion up until this point, or even in admittedly testing at this point, what I would have been doing. But when I started seeing inklings of, not even inklings, when I started seeing more people talk about Fire Nexus, saying it was solid, it seemed good, like Fire had something, I know I had to give it myself a try, because it isn't fair to just go off of my own impression of an element, especially when it's not one that I have widely played. So thus, I picked up the deck, and I've been pleasantly surprised and very much enjoying this deck. So Fire Nexus, as the name entails, has involved fire nexusing, and well, what better than the original Nexuser, Kindleo here. Especially with an effect, a payoff effect that you can target and destroy an opponent's Elestral in a format like we do post ban list, where removal is a lot more sparse and also not as efficient as it once was. Essentially free pop every single turn, once a turn. That's pretty powerful. So thus, this is going to be the cornerstone of the deck and what we're trying to build up towards. And pretty much the whole idea is we get out of Kindleo, we pop an opponent's Elestral, and use the fact that its effect also pushes Fire Spirits to board to start pressuring our opponent's Spirit deck and just start demanding answers, getting ahead or caught up in the Spirit deck race. So yeah, that's the general premise of the deck, so let's get right into the list. Starting off, we got our main guy, Kindleo here. 3 copies of this card. This is what we're building to. This is what we want to also be able to follow up with, even if our previous Kindleo has been removed, so that's 3 copies to make sure we can find it. Now, every Nexuser needs cards to Nexus from. So what I have opted, or at least part of what I've opted to give us cards to Nexus from, is this package of 3 cards here. We got Rummacoal, we've got Volcanic Forge, and most importantly for the Nexus thing, we got Volcanic Forge here, all at 3 copies. So Volcanic Forge, of course, is the stadium. That's our permanent. That's the one we're looking to Nexus from. The reason I really like Volcanic Forge for this role is partially because of this package here, which I'll get into, but also because this card, while it might not be the most optimal in general to Nexus from, because you're going -1 because you're losing the stadium, this card does have flexibility on other applications outside of being used for a Kindleo Nexus. And that to me is more valuable than necessarily keeping the card around, especially when we take into context Stoke the Forge, which now with Volcanic Forge and Stoke the Forge, this is a quick way to get out our Kindleo and then start nexting with it right away. And the best part about this is I can hold the Volcanic Forges until I'm ready to go for that play, and now my opponent needs countermoves to be able to interact with that play. And then what really brings it all together is just Rummacoal here, being able to search out either of these cards, which is just being able to search out Volcanic Forge is independently good to find a Nexus bank, or for its other applications, boosting up our Fire Elestrals, especially Rummacoal, which can get pretty big with this. Or if we already have a Volcanic Forge, we can find Stoke the Forge. And if we have both of these, well, we can either search out another Stoke the Forge to dig for more Elestrals, or another Volcanic Forge for follow-up if we're going to Nexus from the Kindleo, or Nexus from it to the Kindleo. So pretty much if I open any combination of these cards in my opener, I am set to go for this game. And to me, that's just such a nice package, a cohesive package that gives me my Nexus bank. It gives me a way to find Kindleo that just seems phenomenal, which is great consistency. The next package I run to help me with Nexus is the Argo package with Necklace of Harmonia and Poisoned Tunic. This was one that surprised me. I originally saw it in the MBT Elestrals video where he was sharing the Chronodile Water Nexus list that Dyer and Dimex had been working on and sharing with him. And I thought it was a really cool concept to be able to get spirits on board to Nexus from. I was a bit worried in this deck that this would just be too expensive, because one of the reasons why Water Nexus can run is because it's got such great heal tools to be able to make up the spirit differential. In this deck, however, these ended up being great because I can leverage them a bit more for high tempo defensive swings, while also then pivoting into a very high output offensive tempo swing. And on top of that, as I mentioned with the Kindleo, since we're pushing spirits on the board and clearing Elestrals out of the way, we can start attacking the spirit deck directly and putting on much more damage to also get caught up from that spirit deficit. So this deck does have ways to, admittedly a bit riskier if our opponent has a response, but ways to also get caught up that I do think means this package works fairly well in the deck. I've been pleasantly surprised, and I can't see myself cutting, at least not at current. So, of course, 3 Argo because this is the main enabler for it, so we want to find at least one copy of it. 2 copies sometimes can be fine, and the 2 artifacts we choose to run here are the Poison Tunic, just like we saw in the Water Nexus Chronodile deck list. This is just great way to, when our opponent is attacking into a defense position, Celestial, just cause it to bounce off, and then we can just Nexus the spirits away the next turn. This card can also be used offensively, though it isn't as potent, but it still is alright because when the Empowerless is destroyed in battles, controller must expend 2, meaning the 2 spirits used on Tunic converts into 2 burn damage, meaning you're completely even in that spirit differential. And ideally, if you're using it off of Argo, that is also for a tempo swing, meaning that even though you are even trading 2 spirits and going 1, it also means that you're going 1 for 1 in that regard because you're getting rid of your opponent's Celestial, and Argo is really additional minus and 2 spirits, but it's to be able to get that tempo swing, and that's your cost for it. Necklace Harmonia is a bit better for the tempo swing because you empower one of your opponent's Celestials, you also get to keep around then for Kindleo. And the 5 attack is highly relevant. Normally you don't like this because of the burn effect at the end of your turn, but if you're nexusing those spirits away anyway, doesn't matter. You just got a huge tempo swing with further upside. And this deck also has plenty of ways to siphon spirits off anyway if you don't have the Nexus set up, but you really need to get these out ASAP to answer a dire situation. So that's the main Nexus core out of the way. Let's move over to the rest of the Elestrals that we run in this deck. 1 Lavalith, 2 Ashrabbit, 3 Necruff, and 3 Astrabbit. So the reason for these ratios are, well, we can only run 1 Lavalith, but it's a highly impactful card that's also super flexible because we can always normal send into it, meaning that it's totally worth a 1-of since we're natively in fire anyway. And yeah, there's even, since we're not usually going for the Kindleo push until we have something we really want to pop anyway or ready to push, that does mean sometimes our opponent might set up a bit higher spirit on board, meaning the Lavalith's live to also be able to have that play enabled for us. And then, of course, back up by Kindleo the following turn is pretty strong since both require or demand an answer right away, or else, yeah, they're threatening the opponent immensely. 2 Ashrabbit, this card is crazy. Shout out to LUCK. I remember him and I were driving down to Locals a few weeks back, and he was telling me about how he needed an extra 5s for his 5 stacks, his pre-ban list, and how he just decided to slot an Ashrabbit, and it's been like the MVP because in the late game it is insane. And that's exactly how I feel in this deck as well. You are, throughout the course of the game, you're obviously building up cards that you've used that have threatened the opponent in your underworld, and you play a late game Ashrabbit, and you're pretty much telling your opponent, hey, you see these 3 cards that you already dealt with that you really don't want to deal with again? Yeah, give me the one you are okay dealing with the most or are the least terrified of, because regardless, I'm happy. That's what it reads. And then on top of that, in terms of application in this deck, that's just as a card by itself. If we establish this alongside our Kindleo here, the game might as well be over. This is like, no joke, I think this is legitimately a late game version of Sparkit Astrabbit. Is that impactful on the board and the game state. Though, because it's much later in the game, it doesn't feel as unfair as that combo was. But still, very, very potent. Only 2 copies of Ashrabbit because it's not very good in the early game. We do not want to find these in the early game. Just recovering a spirit back isn't all that great. So thus 2 copies, and we of course have the Forge to be, or Stoke the Forge to be able to find it as well. 3 Necruff, it's just a solid 5. We're in fire. It's efficient tool that also demands an answer with what this deck likes to do. Also, the burn helps us get caught up in the spirit differential. I see no reason not to run this card. It's just a really great backup option while I'm trying to get set up, or if I've already set up, my opponent answered it, and I just need to follow up to continue pressuring them. And then finally, 3 Astrabbit. This is just the best turn 1 drop in the game. Phenomenal consistency card even throughout the course of the game. And in a deck that likes to find its pieces, that wants extra consistency, this card is very much appreciated. Like, this deck is highly consistent for that reason, even if it is just digging into more consistency tools, because those consistency tools can then pinpoint search other stuff, such as our Stoke the Forge for our Kindleo. Next up for the counter runes, 3 Tsunami, 3 Gorgon's Gaze, 2 PTA, and 3 Shield of Achilles. So most of these ratios shouldn't be too surprising. I think Tsunami and Gorgon's Gaze are just the strongest counter runes in the game, and especially with less removal, we really want those counter runes to be able to interact with our opponent. And Gorgon's Gaze is the most versatile, Tsunami is the most efficient. 2 Poison Tipped Arrow, and then 3 Shield of Achilles. The reason I also wanted these in here is because it's very important with Kindleo having so low attack to be able to insulate our boards with these counter runes and be able to keep these on board, or even just other pieces on board to help combo with the Kindleo. And these cards accomplish this. They can be a bit counterintuitive considering, you know, the whole goal is to then Nexus with Kindleo to pop stuff, but also with these cards out, it means that we can help build up a wider board, and then even once we've used those and our opponent can get a Elestral established, we then have Kindleo as follow-up to continue pressuring it as well. So while it might seem a bit counterintuitive at first glance, these do complement each other very well for board control, because the other thing is, while of course I said the game plan is establish Kindleo and push, another very effective game plan, and arguably what you should be aiming for, and I try to aim for, is also just building out a wider board, especially to give other stuff to receive that spirit can a lot of times be more efficient than giving it to the Kindleo itself, disperse the pressure. And so these help us get to those sorts of scenarios. Really all of these do, but that's why I do include these as well. Also, I chose the 3 shield over the 3 PTA because there are less Lavaliths in the format, and because of Kindleo, I'm not too worried about having to deal with a Electrolyte bounce afterwards, especially now that I hear, like, I've even seen more Rhinosects being played, more Ascensions. These are really strong against it. I just think shield is a bit more impactful than PTA in that matter in terms of keeping bodies on board and not taking also too much damage. Like, this guarantees I don't take damage. This, though it does permanently remove it. So I've been happy with these ratios. And then finally, 3 Ambrosia for the Invoke rune. Extra recovery is really, really strong. And especially for a deck like this, which is pretty expensive and does try to leverage higher offensive output to catch up, Ambrosia as a way to heal back up to give us more spirits to be able to have more time to build up to Kindleo plays, or just more spirits in general to help insulate our plays, is very, very much appreciated. So this one I have been running it, so I do think 3 is right, because some games can get into a bit of a grind game where it comes down to the wire, and just 3 extra, really this is a net 2 spirits, but I can't say I have an off stop to get 3 extra spirits can really, really come in clutch. If you haven't done so already and you're enjoying this deck profile, please consider subscribing and turn on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. Moving over to the Spirit deck, we run 3 Zaptor. This is pretty standard to enable our Astrabbit. Even though we only have 3, we can easily re-enchant it, so thus we want to have a few extra copies. Really, the 1 extra copy is all we need. 2 Leviaphin for the 2 Tsunami is also pretty standard to make sure, because sometimes we will find 2, we want to cast the 2. And on top of that, even if we don't find the 2, we can always have the option to enchant one of our Elestrals to play around our opponent's Tsunami. And the rest are just Vipyros. That's 15 of them. Since this is a primary fire deck, we want to have plenty of fire spirits to be able to utilize our cards. Now, as for the Mulligan, having Kindleo there is great because it means we can immediately start pushing. And as I mentioned, any combination of Rummacoal, Stoke the Forge, or Volcanic Forge will also get us there. So these are ideal in our opening hand, as well as some counter runes to be able to insulate our plays. Really, we're just kind of looking for any way to establish a body on board. These are more ideal as they help us actually get to our game plan, but we have just such great high value Elestrals. Like, obviously, if you have Astrabbit in hand with some counter runes, keep that. You can just dig and stall for it. It's not anything too special. I think a lot of decks that are running this sort of template just end up wanting like Astrabbit plus some runes or some playable Elestrals, and this deck's no different. You really don't want to keep hands though without some counter runes, because you really do need to insulate your plays with them. Now onto the side deck, this is still a work in progress, but I wanted to share some of the stuff I'm running in here, and that is 3 Thunderstorm, a PTA, and a resting on your Laurels. So the reason for this is, specifically the decks I was testing against were Earth Nexus, Water Nexus, and then the Rhinosect. These are mostly reflective on Earth Nexus and Water Nexus. So specifically with Earth Nexus, I was noticing that because of the Equal Links pressure, cards such as Shield and Argo do a lot less. So therefore I want some stuff to slot in those places because they aren't doing anything for me. An extra PTA makes sense because we can just get rid of the Equal Links right then and there and not have to worry about having a Kindleo per se. It just gives us more removal options for when those arise. Same thing with resting on your Laurels, just a really efficient removal card. And especially with hopefully more Nexus decks popping up, some Ascension decks, this will be live more often. And then I was trying to think of some other cards, because this is only 2 things to slot in if I want to cut out 3 Shield and an Argo, or even slot out Argos. Like, I was still debating on exactly what I cut out. I think I prioritize the Shield more. Still more experimentation need to be done. But I wanted just another option there, and I thought Thunderstorm was pretty good because then you can just snipe the Divine, and that's pretty efficient. We're already running Thunder Spirits, or I shouldn't say is pretty efficient, but if our opponent loads it up and isn't efficiently getting rid of them, or even just still has 2 left, that's totally, I think, worth 2 Thunder Spirits, because now they have to find another Divine to be able to start Nexusing. It's just a huge tempo loss. Other thoughts are to replace Tsunamis in decks that either most efficiently play around it. I was thinking Rhinosect, but sometimes it's more optimal to just set the properly enchanted Rhinosect. So thus, and also it's not like they're a primary water basis anyway, but stuff like Water Nexus also is quite nice. I do think PTA and Laurels is better, but maybe like a run of Thunderstorm to be able to just pop like a Poseidon is also going to be nice to have access to as well. And finally, I just want to mention this because this popped in my head as I was going through this deck profile. I was bumping up Ambrosia to 3, but with more thought, I think it is worth testing out Laurels for one of the Ambrosia, because there are very much situations before you set up the Kindleo that you just have either a single Elestral on your board, your opponent started a set with Divine Runes, or your opponent's just answered your Elestral and they're 2 up on you, where you can just go Laurels, Kindleo, Nexus. So I'm keeping the deck profile as is for what I've tested, but my next step is very much testing out 1 Laurels for the Ambrosia. I'll probably just swap it between side and main and keep the Ambrosia in the side now to be able to slot in for stuff like shields and tsunamis as well. But yeah, it can easily slot in, and I do think this deck has plenty of opportunities, especially with what the meta potentially is looking like to be just a solid option in the main deck. Also, I was filming a Vanguard video before this. I completely forgot to switch out my map to an Elestrals map, so you just get to check out this glorious Lord in the background. But next deck profile, I'll try my best to make sure that I have the proper playmat. But final thoughts on this Fire Nexus deck. Do I think this will be the next Titan of the format? Probably not. I think it's a solid deck. I'll be curious to see, because I really haven't been testing this out too much into the meta, just really against just random decks that I find fun that I want to play test and others want to play test. And it's been doing all right. It's not amazing. Like, I don't think it just trumps everything, but it is able to hold its own. So I do think this is going to be at least a fine rogue option at the bare minimum, if not maybe like a tier 2 deck that can definitely put up tops, but maybe isn't the deck to beat overall. But I also think there's plenty more experimentation that needs to be done with this deck, just in this format in general. So I hope this list at least is a starting point for a lot of you to test or just influence conversation down in the comment section below. Speaking of which, with all this being said though, I want to hear from you all. How are you building your Fire Nexus deck? What kind of text do you have in there that you find to be good and are willing to share? If you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. But with all that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.